Good morning, Pelham Road. All right, back to chapter 16 of Mark, trying to move on down the road here to explain why someone would think verse 8 of chapter 16 was not complete, and why they thought the need to add on to it. Now, this is likely to be very rambling, but I'm going to try to at least start with a direction. The book is called A Textual Commentary on the Greek New Testament, and Bruce Metzger wrote it. He's a brilliant professor. And he writes, Clement of Alexandria and Origen, these would have both been church leaders in the early 3rd century, show no knowledge of the existence of verses 9 through 20. So anytime they talk about the Gospel of Mark, anytime these two church leaders write about Mark's Gospel, they never mention verses 9 through 20. They don't know of its existence. So that means that it comes sometime after 300. Furthermore, Eusebius and Jerome attest that this passage was absent from almost all Greek copies of Mark known to them. And they would have been in the 400s or 500s. Of course, it does say almost all. The language and style of the Greek in verses 9 through 20 is not Markan. And it is evident that the forger was trying to take sections of Matthew and sections of Luke and blending them into Mark. So, there is no doubt these verses were added much later than the writing of the gospel. Okay? So, the gospel ends in verse 8, and that's probably what is circulated originally. And so let's talk about that. Now, there are people who say, well, that's a terrible ending. It is odd. It's a peculiar ending. Granted, Matthew and Luke both end their resurrection stories on high notes. Mark chooses to end, if this is an intentional ending, he chooses to end with fear and abruptness that the women have heard, they know what's going on, and this terrifies them. Some people find that a peculiar way to end. I mean, I will admit, it is a different way to end, no doubt about that. Is it unintended? Some people think that there's an ending to Mark floating around that got cut off, that got tore off, that over time was worn off, that this is really not the ending. 9 through 20 is not the ending either, but that there were a few more verses after verse 8. Maybe that's the case, but we don't know. We'll never know. That's not in any of the oldest manuscripts. It's gone, all right? Some people say, well, maybe he got interrupted. Maybe something happened. That's entirely possible too. But it's also entirely possible that verse 8 is where he wanted to end it. I mean, what is more abrupt than a resurrection? Now, if he intentionally did this, if this was his purpose of writing it was to end it this peculiar, odd way, he certainly gets our attention, okay? Now, why does this guy come in and put 9 through 20 in? Well, see, he thinks that Mark has not told the whole story. You see, Mark says in chapter 14 that Jesus, in talking to his disciples, says that he will be raised. And in chapter 16, what he says has happened at the tomb is that Jesus was raised. Okay? But Jesus has not appeared. And that's what this author is after, this 9 through 20 author. He thinks that we can't know anything until we see an appearance of the Lord. And so what does he concentrate on? He sticks 3 things in here. He says he appeared to Mary Magdalene. That's not what he says in verse 1. But in verse 9, he says he appeared to Mary Magdalene. Then he says he appeared on the road to Emmaus, which comes right out of the Gospel of Luke. And then he says that he appeared to the 11 as they were sitting at a table. Now again, you can find both of those things in Matthew and Luke. But he seems to think that it's a very big deal that he has to show that Jesus appeared. Now Mark doesn't necessarily think that. Mark ends in verse 8 because he doesn't necessarily think that it's terribly important that you have to say that Jesus appeared. He thinks that what is important is to say that Jesus was raised. that Jesus is not here, he's gone on. So probably what's driving this later editor is that he has Matthew, he has Luke, and he sees how Matthew and Luke in their stories, and he sees how Matthew and Luke has these appearances, and he looks at Mark and he thinks, well, Mark looks very inadequate. It doesn't tell the whole story. And so he wants to add to it to make sure that the whole story is told. So I have thought a good deal of time about this, and I have drawn the following conclusions. Mark's original ending, verse 8, I think is intentional. I think it's the precise ending he wanted. I don't think that there's anything missing that was tore off at the end or that there was an abrupt interruption. I think verse 8's the ending. 2, the later edition was done by an editor who thought the appearances of Jesus were necessary to conclude the story. Mark didn't think that was important, but this guy does. 3, the earliest traditions of Christianity did not find post-resurrection appearances as necessary part of the gospel. The earliest writer of the New Testament was Paul. Then we have Mark, who was Peter's biographer, and then we have James. And these are the earliest writers about the life of Christ and the life of the early church. And they did not emphasize these post-resurrection appearances. They did not think that that was necessary. They thought just the declaration and the proclamation that he is raised is enough. So the gospel of God, this is my fourth conclusion, the gospel of God was that God has raised him up, not that we have seen him. The gospel is not we have seen the Lord. The gospel is God has raised him up. The fifth conclusion I've drawn is that the later forms of Christianity, I'm not willing to put a date on it, but the later forms of Christianity reflect very much the need for these appearances. The appearances stories that are in Matthew and Luke and in John begin to drown out the voices and mute the voices of Mark and Paul. Now, this would mean then that since that's the time period in which it became popular to talk about these post-resurrection appearances, that the addition of Mark, chapter 16, verse 9 through 20, comes later. In the hundreds, maybe. But certainly after Paul had written some, and certainly after Mark was written. So, I guess the concluding of this is that the poison and the snakes that we read about yesterday, that wasn't even the most interesting part of this whole story. Most interesting part of this story is sort of why did an editor come in here and feel the need to finish a work that was probably already finished. All right, we'll pick up with something new tomorrow. All right, see you then. Bye.